Hello and welcome back to Chapter 4, Expanding the Main Verb. So far in our study, we've really only been working with simple past and simple present verbs in English, although you didn't know it at the time. Now we are going to work on expanding the main verb. Pretty exciting. Verbs in English have 5 forms. The base form, the S form, the ED form, that's the past tense, the ING form, or present participle, and EN form, past participle. For a regular verb, you'll notice that the ED form and the EN form are going to be the same. So danced is the same in ED and EN forms. But for an irregular verb, the past participle and the past tense are different. Eat, eats, ate, eating, eaten. The only way really to tell the difference between a regular verb and an irregular verb is to look at those past tense and past participle forms, because almost all verbs in English have regular S and ING forms. You can't really tell what's going on if it's regular or irregular unless we look at those past tense and past participle forms. There's one gigantic exception to this, and that's the verb be. Be is so weird. Be is the only verb in English with 8 forms rather than 5. It has a separate base form that's totally different than all its other forms. It has 3 forms in the present tense, not 2. It has 2 forms in the past tense. It also has a separate EN form and a separate ING form. It's crazy, and it's very, very busy. It's one of our auxiliary verbs that comes in the verb expansion formula, and it helps make the passive voice, more on that in Chapter 5. So it's basically the busiest little bee in the English language. Let's talk about this concept of ED and EN forms a little bit more. In regular verbs, the past tense and past participle are the same, so this isn't going to be a problem. But you might get stuck trying to distinguish between the past tense and past participle with an irregular verb. So if you do get stuck trying to think of a verb in the past tense, try making a sample sentence. Let's use our irregular verb eat. Yesterday I ate. Of course, you'd probably say what you ate. Yesterday I ate a slice of cake. If you're having trouble coming up with the past participle, just a sample sentence should do the trick. I have blank this time. I have eaten many slices of cake in my lifetime. So use this little frame. Yesterday I blank for the past tense, and I have blank for the past participle, and you should avoid any difficulties. Let's talk about auxiliary verbs. So far we've been looking at sentences with just a main verb, but the predicating verb can be more than just one simple verb. It can also have what we call auxiliary verbs, that's have and be, that precede it. The main verb is always the last verb in the string. So in the simple past, in this sentence, the main verb is bake. I baked the cake. In this sentence, using the past perfect progressive, the main verb is still going to be bake. I had been baking all afternoon. But the predicating verb we think about a little differently. The predicating verb is still bake in the first sentence, but in the second sentence, the whole shebang, had been baking, is the predicating verb. In the first sentence, we don't have any auxiliary verbs, just the main verb. That's allowed. In the second sentence, we are using both auxiliary verbs, have and be, to produce had been, and also our main verb to get baking. Have and be, those are the auxiliary verbs in English. We also have modal auxiliary verbs, which we talked about a little bit in Chapter 13. 4 of the modal auxiliary verbs have tense and 2 do not. The ones that do not have tense are must and ought to. We don't have to apply tense to them. They just don't take it. But there are 4 that do have tense. Will, may, can, and should. Present will, past would. Present may, past might. Present can, past could. And present shall, you don't hear that one very much these days, past should. Be aware, just because we're using the past tense doesn't mean that the action took place in the past when it's applied to a modal. If I said I should buy some shoes, the modal is in the past tense, but actually I haven't bought the shoes, right? I should. So be advised that past tense doesn't always mean the action took place in the past when we're dealing with modals. A little more on modals now. We have lots of ways with auxiliaries and modals to add to the verb string. So let's take a basic sentence. I go to the store. I'm going to add the auxiliary have plus en. I have gone to the store. Okay, I'm going to add the auxiliary be plus ing. I am going to the store. More on these aspects in a minute. And we have our 4 primary modal auxiliaries, can, will, shall, and might. I can go to the store, I will go to the store, I shall go to the store, and I might go to the store, as well as the stand-in auxiliary do, which doesn't take a tense, more on that in a minute, and the other 2 auxiliaries that don't take a tense, must and ought to. I do go to the store, I must go to the store, or something I say a lot, I ought to go to the store. Those are our sort of primary modals, but there are also marginal modals, which we talked about quite a bit in chapter 13. Have to, be going to, used to, and be to, as in we have to buy gasoline. We are going to run out of gas. If we don't, we used to get better gas mileage. We are to get the car serviced next week. The marginal modals are underlined here, and the main verb is bolded. All of this stuff, just like with a regular modal, goes on the main line. Okay, things are about to get a little bit tense. We have to talk about tense in order to understand the verb expansion formula. When we say tense in English, a lot of people are confused about what we actually mean, because we do have a true present tense and a true past tense, but that's it. We just have 2. A lot of people don't understand that. They would say, what about the future? What about the future tense? Many languages do have a true future tense, but we don't. When we want to talk about something in the future, instead of using a tense, we use a modal. We use either the modal verb will or the marginal modal be going to. Let's look at the verb cook for an example. Simple present, I cook. Simple past, I cooked. Look, tense is happening. But I can't make the future using tense. I have to use the modal will, I will cook, or the marginal modal be going to, I am going to cook. We don't just have to be talking about the future when we use the modal will. We might also be talking about willingness, as in I'll help, predictability, they will enjoy that, or obligation, you will be there on time, or else. This understanding of tense really sets us up to use the verb expansion formula. Yay! A bit of fanfare here on the verb expansion formula front, because now we actually get to memorize a formula, just like math class. Who knew we could do this in English? Here it is, the verb expansion formula. T, M in parentheses, have plus en in parentheses, be plus ing in parentheses, MV, that's tense, modal, auxiliary, main verb. If it's in parentheses, then it's optional. The only things you have to have are tense and a main verb. Everything else we have the option to use. When we use auxiliary have, we're putting the en ending, that's the past participle ending, onto the next verb in the string. And the same with the auxiliary be. When we use it, we are applying the present participle, the ing, to the next verb in the string. Let's look at some examples using The Bachelor. When we talk about tense, we're talking about present and past, but when we're talking about aspect, what we mean is we're using these different combinations of auxiliary verbs to give more nuance to the way we talk about time. So simple present, we don't have any auxiliaries. This is simply the present tense onto the base form or the S form of the verb. I watched The Bachelor. Simple past is just the past tense onto the main verb. I watched The Bachelor last week. Present perfect. Here we are using the auxiliary verb have plus en. Present onto have, I have. En onto the main verb, watch, I have watched. I have watched The Bachelor already. I picked a regular verb to make this a little bit easier. Past perfect, we will use the past tense this time, as well as the auxiliary have plus en. Past onto have, I had. En onto main verb, watched. I had watched The Bachelor, but then I quit. You may be wondering, how do I remember that if I'm using have plus en, I'm using the perfect aspect? One of my past students had a great mnemonic device for this. Have plus en is very close to the word heaven, and heaven is perfect. So there you go. It's got to be the perfect aspect. When we use be plus ing, we're using the progressive aspect. So pres onto be, I am. Ing onto main verb, I am watching The Bachelor right this very moment. Past progressive, past onto be, I was. Still the ing ending onto the main verb, I was watching The Bachelor during class. Tisk, tisk. And we can combine these aspects to form the present perfect progressive. It sounds scarier than it is. We use pres onto have, that's I have, en onto be, past participle of be is been, I have been, and then ing onto the main verb, watching. I have been watching The Bachelor since Jake's season. Or past perfect progressive. Past onto have is had. Some people have a little bit of trouble with the past tense of have. I had, en onto be is been, ing onto mb is watching. I had been watching The Bachelor even before it was cool. Just a few more concepts to help us understand how verb strings work. We also have this thing called the stand-in auxiliary do. Lots of people would have put this on the list of auxiliaries with have and be, but our book doesn't, and that's because the stand-in auxiliary do isn't for making aspects really. It's for helping with specific kinds of sentences. Negative sentences, certain kinds of questions, and adding emphasis. So if I said something like, Brad does not love you, I'm using the do to help me say it differently instead of, Brad loves you not. Or, do you like funnel cake? Instead of, hey, you like funnel cake? Or to add a little extra emphasis, you do run marathons, because it would be so boring to just say you run marathons. So do is being used as an auxiliary. It is not carrying any verb ending rules with it, and that's another reason why we think of it as sort of a stand-in auxiliary rather than a true auxiliary itself. Let's talk about mood for a moment. The subjunctive mood. So when we talk about mood, we're talking about different verb forms. We've been using the indicative mood this whole time for statements of fact or opinion. We're using declarative sentences, so that makes sense. There's also the imperative mood, which we use for commands. And then there's the subjunctive mood, which doesn't get a lot of love in English. We just don't pay that much attention to it. It shows necessity, desire, unreality, or conjecture. And one of the reasons we don't pay very much attention to it is because the present subjunctive is exactly the same as the indicative mood, which we use all the time in the present. If you see a that following the verb, you might be using the subjunctive without even thinking about it. Dr. Kenley insisted that we practice our sentence diagrams, expressing desire in this case. In the past, the subjunctive mood is a little different because we use were instead of was, even if we're talking about a singular subject. If he were rich, he would buy me a pony, or would that it were so simple. There's a lot of information that we have just covered, and it is going to be crucial that you practice it on your own. We can only do so much in class. Much of it comes down to the work you are able to put in as well. But don't worry, after practice, these expansions of the verb string will become second nature. Cassidy says she knows this is tough, but she also knows you're up for the challenge. Keep up the good work, practice, practice, and we'll talk to you soon.